Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second day of ArtFilm International CEO Forum 2023. We will kick-start the session this morning with an interesting Heart Talk session. Our speaker today is President, Chief Executive Officer, Export-Import Bank of Malaysia Berhad, or Exim Bank. He brings multi-jurisdictional banking and finance experience, especially in the areas of corporate banking, debt capital markets, Islamic finance, asset management, and development finance. He holds a Bachelor of Law degree from the International Islamic University Malaysia and a Master of Business Administration from the London Business School, United Kingdom. He is also a chartered banker with the Asian Institute of Chartered Bankers and was elected to the Securities Commission Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies Fellowship in Islamic Finance at the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies in 2015. This session will be moderated by Ms. Fairuz Abdul Hamid, Adjunct Professor UNITAR International University, with over 30 years of experience in public and private sector, as well as academia. Ms. Fairuz's experience range from strategy, transformation, innovation, communications, reputation management, crisis management, governance and democracy, business and human rights, as well as sustainability. Throughout his career journey, Ms. Fairuz managed to interview many key leaders and politicians. Ladies and gentlemen, the Fireside Chat with CEO. Join me to invite on the stage yang berbahagia Encik Arshad Muhammad Ismail, President and CEO Exim Bank Malaysia Berhad, and the moderator, Ms. Fairuz Abdul Hamid. Please welcome. Without any further ado, the floor is yours, Ms. Fairuz and Encik Arshad.
Assalamualaikum.
Assalamualaikum and a very good morning again. I'm Fairuz Abdul Hamid and today on a different mission. Fireside Chat is a chat that's supposed to be quite informal. It was, just as a quick background, it was started by President Roosevelt in United States, the 32nd President of America. He used to have these chats with the press by the fireside, very informal. So today, we're trying it for the first time, I think, at FIM, to do this fireside chat. So the format, I hope, Ashrad, my suggestion is about 10 to 15 minutes, an intro by you, and then Q&A. And then we'll open it to the floor to ask him questions as well.
Fairuz, I have no idea what I've signed up for.
But it's informal, so not scripted. Any questions can come to you. You can choose to answer or not to answer, or take the Fifth Amendment, as they say. Except that we don't have, do we have the Fifth Amendment in Malaysia?
No, we don't.
We don't, so there you go. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning to everybody. As I just mentioned, I have no idea what I've signed up for. So I hope you'll find this session interesting. I consider myself the opening act for the session that will come after this. Now, what can I say? I guess I have to talk a little bit about who I am and how things have evolved over the years. I studied locally in the Klang Valley. After completing high school, I studied in a local university. I'm a lawyer by training, for those who don't know. And for the first 7 to 8 years of my career, I was with a local law firm practicing as a lawyer. And I was then given the opportunity to join CIMB in the Islamic Finance Department. And my career then sort of evolved within the banking field, initially in Kuala Lumpur and then in the Middle East, in Dubai, Jeddah, Abu Dhabi. and I came back to join an international organization in Malaysia. And in 2019, again, I was fortunate enough to be given the opportunity to lead a development finance institution. And now perhaps I can say that at that point in time, I didn't know what I was getting myself into. But that's, I guess, another conversation for another day. And today I'm with Exim Bank, helping the bank deliver on its mandate. So that, in a nutshell, is who I am from a professional perspective.
So let's just take a few steps back. Childhood, born, brought up.
I was born in PJ, to be specific,
Oh,
Asunta
okay.
Hospital.
So you're city boy. So So you kept saying you didn't know what you were getting yourself into in the course of your career. What do you feel the poignant points in your childhood and in your growing times that has molded your values in making the choices that you have made thus far? Is it family, faith, mistakes that you might have fallen into? That might be useful lessons for us to learn from.
Sure. I'm not sure how much people here want to hear about my personal history, but here goes. Obviously, family had a huge impact on my perspective on things. And from a professional perspective, my late father had a tremendous impact on my outlook. My mother,
How so?
Well, he had a very difficult childhood. I can't say that my childhood was difficult because my dad made sure that the family would not have to experience the difficulties he had to experience. So in that sense, my siblings and I were very fortunate. And he was a lawyer all his life. In fact, he was finalizing a legal opinion 3 days before he passed away while in hospital.
So your father's a lawyer?
Yeah, he was a lawyer. He was a lawyer. And as I said, his sort of perspective on things, on what is right and what is wrong, has sort of molded my perspective on life, on how I behave as a professional, and what I believe is right and what I believe is wrong. Of course, it's still an evolution, but that is the biggest sort of impact on how my perspective has been formed over the years.
So and you studied in the UK, and how much of that also formed your values?
No, I studied locally at the International Islamic University. I went to the UK for my master's.
Oh, yeah, your master's as well.
Yeah.
So how much of that had an impact?
Well,
Or did it have an impact? You also did a year in Oxys, right?
and that's right, yes. Because, my early years were all here in Malaysia. I would say my years in Malaysia have a more profound impact on who I am as a professional, as a person. Of course, we all evolve as we grow older, and I have evolved as a professional. My outlook on things when I started my career was very different to my outlook on things today.
So share with us some aspects of the difference in working in a bank like CIMB and then Bank Pembangunan and now the Exim Bank. How are these three institutions different, and how do you navigate in these institutions as a leader and a professional and a leader?
Perhaps it would be better for me to answer this question from my perspective as an individual, as opposed to trying to explain, what each organization is like. So in the context of CIMB, I was with the investment bank, the Islamic finance department to be specific. And then later in the Middle East, I was with different investment banks. And today I'm with a development finance institution. In an investment bank, as much as I hate to say this, you are driven by the desire to make as much money as possible for the institution so that at the end of the year, you are rewarded. I know that's an oversimplification, but I think at least when I was a lot younger, 20 years ago, that was the priority. Of course, we had to make sure that we executed transactions in line with acceptable standards, with applicable, with the relevant sort of professional considerations being taken into account. But ultimately, you wanted to close the transaction so that we can talk about how successful the transaction was. The bank makes money. At the end of the year, you're rewarded. And if you believe that you have not been rewarded, in a sense that you believe it's fair, then you start sort of asking yourself whether you should continue serving that organization or whether you should move on to a different organization. But over the years, as I said, we evolve as professionals and our thinking also evolves. A development finance institution is so very different to how an investment bank operates. And everyone here.
How so?
Well, in the case of a development finance institution, it's all about delivering on the mandate, right? And I still remember in 2019, when I first joined Bank Pembangunan, we paid a visit to the governor, and this was about a month after I joined. And she said that Bank Pembangunan might no longer be relevant, and I was taken aback. Here I was, a brand new CEO at Bank Pembangunan, going over to see the governor, and she says to me, your bank is not relevant. So what do? I just left my job at a commercial bank to join this development finance institution. But she made a very important point. She said that at that point in time, the bank was perhaps perceived to be competing with commercial banks. And that was a wake-up call for me and for my board members at that point in time. And we went back to the drawing board to figure out what we were doing wrong and what we had to do to be in a position to deliver on our mandate. And my former colleague was up on stage yesterday, Hussein Mullah, and he was talking about the MIND framework. And that was one initiative we put in place to help the bank focus on its mandate, because it's not always about making money. That might sound strange coming from a banker, but in the context of a development finance institution, it's more about delivering on your mandate.
But let me just interrupt you there. How do you switch from a culture of working where money, the key driver is making money, to a key driver is serving a mandate? So how in such different environment, what becomes the purpose of doing the job? What drives when there's so much money in front of you, especially in places like investment bank? How do you find purpose to your work, as it were?
How do I find purpose
in an environment where where money was first the driver, and then you're able to move on to an environment where money isn't the driver anymore and a mandate? How would you, I think I'm not framing the questions, how would you advise a talent that you meet at an investment bank who might be going up the ladder in that investment bank to join a bank where money may not necessarily be the driver, but a mandate of serving a society? In these two environments, there must be a purpose within you to have helped you make that leap from this environment to that. Am I not correct?
I think I understand the question.
Yeah.
How did I sort of transition from, well, prior to joining Bank Pembangunan, I was with a commercial bank. So how did I make the transition from being a commercial banker to being a development finance professional with a lot of difficulty. I have to confess, it was difficult.
Difficult in the sense of how was it?
Well, for one, from the perspective of credit risk management, I, at that point in time, chaired the Management Credit Committee. But today, I still chair the Management Credit Committee. And when you are at an investment bank or a commercial bank, and when you look at credit, you have the liberty to reject credits that don't quite meet your requirements, right? So you have the option of approving only the best credits for your bank. But in a development finance institution, I wish I could say that. Life would be so much easier for me as the chairman of the credit committee if the committee were to approve only credits of exceptional quality. But that is not necessarily the case. We are often presented with credits that are not quite A+ in terms of quality. So we have to figure out how to strike a balance between protecting the bank's portfolio and delivering on the mandate.
And managing stakeholders.
And
So can you help us understand some of these factors? Some of us who might want to learn. Like, how do you manage your stakeholders were at Bank Pembangunan, and currently also is the government of Malaysia, right? And then you have the bank shareholders, and also then there's the aspect of governance that you have to meet vis-a-vis financial industry. So how do you manage these three different aspects?
Again, I have no idea, and with a lot of difficulty. And one of the biggest issues relates to our capital base. Since joining Exim Bank, I've had the pleasure of meeting with colleagues from other countries, colleagues from Japan, from Korea, from Indonesia, and other countries. And in many of these jurisdictions, the Exim banks in those jurisdictions receive periodic capital injections. These are development finance institutions. By definition, these institutions are meant to onboard transactions that are relatively risky, a lot riskier than what a commercial bank would be prepared to onboard. When you onboard relatively risky transactions, the chances of these transactions turning impaired are relatively high as well. But if we are afraid of onboarding transactions that could turn impaired, then we will have problems delivering on the mandate. But in some other jurisdictions, the governments actually provide capital injections on a periodic basis. In Malaysia, we do not get such periodic capital injections, not at Exim Bank. Of course, we have to figure out innovative ways to address this issue, but not at Bank Pembangunan, not at Exim Bank. I'm not sure about some of the other development finance institutions. So we have to figure out how to deliver on the mandate, how to protect the portfolio, whilst keeping all our stakeholders happy. I know I'm not answering the question, but it's simply because it is a difficult issue to address.
Yeah, so I it's a huge issue, but let's try and a lot of factors. But stakeholder management for DFIs, for example, as we are in a DFI conference. Do our main stakeholder fully understand the nature of business? And in the instances that they do not understand, because naturally there is a constant transition of governments in the last 4 years, as it were, what are the roles of CEOs to help stakeholders understand in the shortest period of time such that they are partners in you delivering your target, as opposed to obstacles to you delivering your target? How, if it's not good at, if it's not ideal at the moment, what could be optimal?
My main stakeholders, the Ministry of Finance and Bank Negara, fully understand what a development finance institution is meant to do. So in terms of the key stakeholders understanding, no problem. But there is still a problem in the context of having sufficient capital to deliver on the mandate. And that is really an issue that I guess we cannot solve within 6 months or 12 years. But to answer your question, no, I typically do not have a problem with my stakeholders understanding the mandate of a DFI.
Oh, so that's okay. Moving on to key challenges that you faced in your life that has helped you in your leadership positions. If you had to pick one or two, what would they be, and what are the learning lessons from those that has helped you in your next job? Can you share?
As in challenging situations?
Yes.
I have more than one or two.
We have time for two.
Okay. Yeah, maybe, well, 20 years ago, obviously I was a lot younger. I had a lot more hair, believe it or not. 20 years ago, I was with an investment bank. And as I mentioned earlier, the culture was to, do your transactions, pick up awards, and then at the end of the year, you get rewarded. And during the annual assessment, my then boss had a chat with me, and he said that, Arshad, technically, you're fine, but being technically good at what you do won't take you very far. You need to focus on the non-technical aspects of who you are as a professional. And this made me very angry because I had a reasonably good year. We concluded a good number of transactions. And here was my boss trying to tell me that despite what I thought was a fantastic year for me, I wasn't good enough. And it was quite difficult for me to accept. And as a professional, it's important for us to have what I often refer to as intellectual humility. What does that mean? It means that we must be prepared to be told that we have shortcomings, among other things. But 20 years ago, I wasn't prepared to hear my boss telling me that I wasn't as good as I thought I was. And believe it or not, I didn't forgive my boss for a good 2 to 3 years because I couldn't accept the fact that I wasn't as good as I thought I was. That's number one. And maybe, some of you might have had similar sort of conversations with your bosses, but trust me, ladies and gentlemen, with the benefit of hindsight, I'm saying that in such a situation, it is important to take a step back and to reflect on what your stakeholders, what your bosses are telling you about what you're good at and what you might not be, what you might not be good at. Maybe about 8 or 9 years after that, I was with another organization. And this was immediately after, or actually during, the global financial crisis. So if you remember, the global financial crisis hit us in mid-2008. And the markets where I was back then came to a standstill. And I relocated to Jeddah to join a local boutique investment bank. And I was tasked with setting up a fund that would focus on real estate in Saudi Arabia. To cut a long story short, we spent about 6 to 8 months developing the fund. And then it became my responsibility to find investors. And this was, if you can imagine, 2010. It was my responsibility to look for investors. And I spent the next 6 months going around the Middle East. I sort of traveled to this part of the world as well, looking for investors. At the end of that journey, I had 0 investors. And obviously, from the perspective of the shareholders and the Saudi CEO, I had failed. And again, this was a painful realization. From the perspective of structuring the fund, I know and I thought we did a fantastic job. But at the end of the day, if you don't have investors subscribing, then it is a failure. And that was a very important lesson for me as well. It's not about how much work you do. Of course, you did good work, but then if the outcome doesn't sort of give you what you initially set out to do, then it's a failure. And again, to cut a long story short, my position at that organization was no longer tenable, and I left because...
So the learning lesson from that was?
The learning lesson from so many lessons, you have to look at things holistically. I guess the mistake I made was I was just looking at the structuring component of that assignment. My focus was to make sure that the fund structure was perfect. But I guess forgot about how the success of the fund would depend very much on the number of investors who subscribe or who buy units in that fund. So that was, I mean, now it's quite obvious to everybody sitting in this hall. Of course, if you want to talk about a successful fund, it's all about how many investors come in and buy units in your fund. But when you are, in that situation, working very hard day and night, trying to put together a perfect fund structure, you might tend to forget.
So this morning we all read that the former Goldman Sachs banker was given 10 years. His name was Roger Ng, for the 1MDB debacle in New York. He's Malaysian. There's so many questions around this that I'd like to ask you, but first one is, some of these are driven by the natural instincts of human being, greed, power. Those animals are in all of us. It's not in some of us, but it's in all of us. How do we moderate this when so much is exposed to us, when temptations are exposed to us? Number one. Number two, how do we moderate those instincts? Number two, I know this is a subject very close to your heart. What is the role of boards in such an instance in institutions, and then the role of governance in institutions to ensure such does not happen or is minimized?
If you could sort of rephrase the question so that I know.
Okay, so number one, how do we, when there's so much of temptation is placed in front of us, we know we compromised here on our values, we might really make quite a lot. How do we moderate our temptations as human beings with our value system? Because even if we have strong-based value system, the environment that we operate in might push us in different directions. What could stop a person from, what could we do to stop ourselves, or what could we do to stop others from going awry, from going off board? Number one, as an individual. And then also as an institution, how can boards and management ensure that this sort of events does not happen? Money laundering, looting, in the name of making profit, for the institution. And then number three, is the governance standards in our institutions, DFIs, good enough to prevent such an incident, in your view?
Three big questions.
after which we'll open the questions to the floor.
Okay, let me try to start by answering the first question. In a big bank, especially in a big international bank, decision making is decentralized. In a DFI, in Malaysian DFIs, typically decision making is centralized. So that's one critical difference. Now, how does this difference impact on the outcome of the decision? Of course, there's no guarantee that one structure is better than the other structure. So let's look at the decentralized decision-making model in big international banks. And we all know the issues that we have seen in big international banks. And those decisions, especially in the context of the treasury business, in the context of derivatives and things like that, the objective is to make as much money as possible for the institution. And, traders at Barclays, traders at, I believe, some of the French banks made certain decisions that were not in line with principles of good governance. Of course, they made money at that point in time, but over time, those transactions went south and the banks lost a lot of money. So because of the decentralized decision-making model, in fact, an individual trader back then had the authority to trade up to millions of dollars, depending on which bank we're talking about. But in the context of local banks and DFIs in particular, more so in DFIs than in commercial banks, decision-making is centralized. And sometimes I ask myself whether it's so centralized that management doesn't have room to move. And sometimes
But when it's centralized, can that be overruled though by the powers?
No. Well, of course.
Okay, so that's three answers.
No.
Yeah, no, well, of
No,
course.
if the structure is right, then it shouldn't be a problem. But I have to confess that in the context of DFIs, we've had some decisions that were made without due regard to basic principles of governance. That much I can say. And I hope that we will never have to deal with such scenarios again going forward. But in the past, without a doubt, I can confirm to you, we have had DFIs making decisions based on, what's the right word, directives from powers that be.
Is that still the case though?
No, not since not to say I've not had to deal with such directives. And when I receive such letters, the standard operating procedure is to respond to those letters with facts. But no directive has come my way.
Okay, at this point, we'll open the floor to questions. Anyone for questions? Too early in the morning? No questions? Please. Gentleman at the back. Mike, please. And two questions. Yeah. And then the gentleman at the back, followed by the lady in the front. Yeah. Cik yang kat belakang tu. Yeah. Just introduce yourself and then the questions.
Good morning. Assalamualaikum. I'm Razak from Bank Rakyat. Listening to you, coming from having both side of experience from commercial and development bank, similarly to me, I just would like to hear something from your side. How do you juggle between the two perspective of banking? You were saying that when you were in commercial banking, you have the liberty to select the best credit, but in the different the current environment, you are subject to developmental role where the risk may be higher, maybe the credit may not be as what it is before. How do you juggle that kind of what do you call process of assessment and so on? Whether do you compromise certain criteria and so on? My second question is that I was attracted to your statement just now when your engagement with the governor. When the governor was saying that the Bank Pembangunan may not be relevant at that point in time. Having said that, Bank Pembangunan had its own developmental role. What could be the moving forward if it is really meant for closure or merger because of certain decision, and whether that role, where would that role be taken over, or is it going to be taken over by another organization, or is it going to be merged into another organization? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, you got that?
Yeah, I
So
think
the first,
so.
first one is how do you reconcile between having worked in commercial banking stroke investment banking versus the mandates sort of environment? And then the second one is the role of DFI, and if it's not relevant, then what happens to?
Walaikum
Correct,
salam.
right? That's the nature. Yeah.
Walaikum salam. I wish I could give you a clever answer to the first question, but I don't have a clever answer. And that's why when we go to our credit committee with difficult transactions, it's not enough to just talk about the mandate, because clients or customers will come to the bank and say that as a government bank, we have a duty, supposedly, to help certain entrepreneurs fund certain projects. But we have to be cautious because we are not in the business of giving grants, right? We are not in the business of giving handouts. And I'm sure where you are, you probably have had similar experiences. And that's why I said, and I say again, that I don't have a clever answer in terms of how to strike a balance. But that is not good enough an answer. In the context of Bank Pembangunan, of course, I'm no longer with Bank Pembangunan, but on the back of the comment made by the governor, we went back and tried to ask ourselves how Bank Pembangunan should change in terms of in terms of doing business. And we decided that it's important for the bank to focus on the impact of its financing, because at that point in time, the bank was focusing purely on credit considerations. You look at the ratios, you look at the the numbers, the financials, and if all these factors look good, then you approve the financing. And that is similar to how a commercial bank looks at transactions. Of course, in the case of a commercial bank, it would sort of reject the weaker credits. In the case of a DFI, you might be more comfortable because of the mandate onboarding weaker credits. But really, that's not good enough of an approach. And when you have a framework to understand the impact your financing will have on your stakeholders, then the decision-making process becomes easier. Now, what do I mean by that? The framework will categorize projects into 4 broad categories. You have projects, or you have, a proposal that is strong from a financial perspective, and that same proposal is strong from a developmental impact perspective. Now, such transactions are the best transactions. Strong from a financial perspective, strong from a developmental impact perspective. Proceed. grant the financing. And then you have transactions or proposals that are weak from a financial perspective, but perhaps strong from a developmental impact perspective. We should consider, or a development finance institution should consider, because of the mandate. And then, of course, you have, I would say, the worst category: weak financials, weak developmental mandate. You should walk away. And of course, over time, it will become easier for the DFI to make such decisions despite, say, challenging financials and cash flows. So that was the first question. And we are embarking on a similar project at Exim Bank. Today, we don't have that framework to help us make non-financial decisions with regard to the viability of proposals from the perspective of a developmental impact. So I've told the team that we need to have a similar framework because we can't keep focusing on the financials and talk about the developmental impact in very superficial terms. We must be able to measure, and we must be able to report the number of jobs that are being created by the projects we are financing. We must be able to talk about the sort of a carbon footprint and things like that. So these are all elements of development finance that we have to measure and report. We're not there yet, and that's why we have started work on putting in place a framework. So that's question number one. I hope I've addressed your question. The second one?
Second one was moderating. Sorry. The second one was?
You were saying about the fact that the governor was saying
Oh,
that
the government. How do you make
the Bank Bangunan was not relevant at the point in time.
Yeah. So how do you make it relevant? Correct.
How do you make relevant? If it's materialized, what would happen to the developmental role?
Who takes it over?
Yeah, who takes over? How do you manage that? Having said that, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Now, in general terms, the development finance institutions in Malaysia have specific mandates and they remain relevant. Having said that,
they remain relevant. Do we still need DFIs in your view?
Definitely, we need DFIs.
Why can't commercial bank and investment banks take this over and just open a department of development? Why do we need like 10 big banks with lots of employees? No, I'm just being the devil's advocate. Like we already have GLC-based banks, commercial, stroke retail, stroke investment. Why can't there just be a department within those banks to address social mandates as opposed to the existing? I'm not making you lose your job, but it's a question. Are DFIs relevant in this time and age?
Absolutely.
And for how long though? DFIs have a social mandate. So that mandate means you have to meet a target. So is this a never-ending target? Are DFIs here to stay, or they need to start withdrawing from market after a target is reached?
Now, DFIs remain relevant, and that's why it's important for DFIs to be able to measure the impact they have on nation building, right? So if DFIs are not able to measure and report the impact they have on nation building, then this question will keep cropping up. Having said that, we do have too many DFIs. In the context of the merger discussions that have been taking place over the last 3 to 4 years, when I was at Bank Pembangunan, we did look at the DFI landscape in Malaysia, and we looked at the DFI landscapes in several other jurisdictions. And what was clear to us back then was that in Malaysia, we might have too many DFIs. Now, which DFI should perhaps be merged with which other DFI? That's not a question for me to answer. That's a question for our stakeholders to answer.
But there are too many DFIs. That's a fact.
Yes. Based on the assessment undertaken, I have to agree that we have too many DFIs, and there are areas where DFIs tend to overlap with each other. But in the context of Exim Bank, our mandate is clear. Of course, I have to say that because my colleagues are here as well. No, but and everyone is aware that in the context of the merger discussions, 4 DFIs were named back in 2019. We completed the first phase of the merger with Bank Pembangunan taking over Dana Jamin back in 2021 September. And the plan was for phase 2 to commence. But in the context of phase 2, the question that keeps arising is whether it would be a good idea taking into account the mandates of BPMB, the mandate of Exim, and the mandate of SME Bank. So the current thinking is that these 3 DFIs now, BPMB, SME, and Exim, have distinct mandates, and bringing them together might not be the right thing to do. Of course, you will get different views depending on who you speak with.
Okay. Would you like to ask your question?
Assalamualaikum, morning. Zurina from Agro. Actually, you
Waalaikumsalam.
answer half of my question already.
Okay, good.
I would like to ask about the merger, but you answered it just now. But the question that I would like to ask, you came from a commercial bank. I, similar with Razak just now, is it? Also came from a commercial bank to DFI. So at the CEO point of view, when you come from a commercial bank, do you manage to change the culture of DFI? And how you do it? Thank you.
We need another hour on this one.
Okay.
Culture.
Yeah. Now, it's an open secret that we often talk about the culture at DFIs, and
And what is the culture at DFI?
Yeah,
It's
and
for
it's-
non-DFI participants.
it's actually a painful topic for me, especially when people say that DFIs don't operate the way, say, commercial banks operate. And of course, some parts of that statement are true, but there are other parts that are not true. And let me tell you why certain parts of that statement are not true. In the context of originators, for example, like commercial banks, we have originators at DFIs. And I've told some of my originators that they would be able to walk in to any commercial bank and do well, because some of my originators, have to work on the origination process from the beginning until the very end. In a commercial bank, typically, this process is
Done by a few people.
yes, done by different departments. You have people who do nothing but the so-called wining and dining, and then another department does the drafting of the credit proposal, and yet another department handles yet another part of the process. And that's how big commercial banks are set up. And there are advantages in structuring your business units in this way. But in the context of many DFIs, I can't say that I know how all DFIs are designed and operate. But in many DFIs, we don't have the luxury of a big workforce. We don't have the luxury of a big workforce whereby we can assign 10 people to handle part A of the process, 10 people to handle part B, and so on. So they end up doing everything from A to Z.
So let me try and focus. We've got about 10 minutes left. I think there is a general perception, and I've been on both sides. I've worked in the civil service. I've also worked in PLCs. There is a general perception that those who work in a government-based institution, be that a GLC or a DFI or civil service, are not as productive and not as bright as those who work in PLCs and global institutions. I know that it's not a fact, but it's a perception that needs to be dealt with. How does one deal with that perception from a leadership standpoint?
Okay. Now, I have to start by saying that it is an unfair generalization.
Yeah.
Number one. Number two, at the same time, I cannot deny that we do have a so-called culture problem at DFIs. And
what specific, culture is a huge topic, but what's specific in culture that you're talking about?
for example, we might not be as aggressive as commercial banks or investment banks because, we tend to sit and wait for deals to come in. So that's one perception. And
how are the boards in comparison?
How are?
The quality of boards in comparison between a DFI and a commercial bank?
Definitely, there are shortcomings in terms of the composition of boards. And this is something that the relevant stakeholders need to look at in an objective manner and address the shortcomings.
So can the CEOs of DFIs with ATFIM not propose to the stakeholders to strengthen board?
I don't have that authority. I don't know whether the other CEOs...
But how to strengthen board to therein strengthen DFIs?
Well,
collectively, as an effort and initiative.
I think it boils down to the question of training, and it applies to CEOs, management, and board members. And problems arise when the CEO or members of management or board members believe that they don't need training. I think that's a good start. That's a good start because we all have our strengths. We often forget about our weaknesses, but we all have weaknesses. And if the stakeholders pay attention to ensuring that board members, CEOs, and members of management are continuously trained at the right level in terms
stakeholders ensure.
Yes.
Stakeholders being the government of Malaysia.
Well, that's one stakeholder, but the sort of organization itself, the board itself must ensure that enough attention is given to the training requirements of these stakeholders in the context of DFIs.
Any other questions? Mike, please. Thank you. Oh, here, this.
We're gonna move a little bit away from the relevancy of DFIs to a different question. I have had the opportunity, fortunate or unfortunate, to be able to sit with many CEOs. And I do know they put 110% into what they do, right? They work very long hours, sometimes 7 days a week. And I'd like to know what your schedule is like in a week, how many hours you work, and how do you keep sane, essentially. Thank you.
Having been in the DFI space for 4 years now, it's a little easier. In the early days, when I first entered the DFI world, I have to confess I was struggling because the environment was quite new to me. And the issues I had to deal with at that point in time were significant issues that I didn't have immediate answers to in terms of how to resolve them. But I think it's a matter of, number one, understanding and accepting the environment you are in. You have to, tell yourself that you cannot control everything. People who, are used to being in control of everything will have serious problems in an environment where you simply cannot control everything, especially when you're dealing with external stakeholders, be they the regulators or enforcement authorities and sort of parties like that. But coming back to your question, I would say my schedule is similar to the schedule of any other CEO running an institution with various issues, running an institution that has targets to meet. So I don't consider that a challenge per se. It's just part and parcel of the job. But what is critical is to have a team that shares your vision, a team, of course, that has the capacity to deliver what is expected of them.
How do you spot talents? Like today, I'm sure there's. How do you know this one is someone I might want to interview?
Well, it boils down to sometimes just gut feeling. Of course, backed by the person's passion, the person's intellectual capacity.
Do you need to see the CV before you spot a talent? CV important in this time and age? Do you speak first to the person before you see this? In the past, we all had to like load up the CV and, beautify the CV. But today, how do you spot a talent?
Well, Faros, I wish I could say that I take one look and I know, but
No, but at your position,
I'm not there yet.
a lot, yeah.
I still sort of do it the traditional way. I have a look at the CV, but having a look at the CV is definitely not enough. The conversation is still important.
So what do you, when you're interviewing someone, and they call it the elevator presentation, yeah, which is like you only have 10 seconds, and somebody really wants a job at Exim Bank, and I only have 10 seconds with Arshad. What is the one thing that you wanted? I know I'm putting you in a very difficult position here, but if someone was with you for 10 seconds and you 10 or 20, give it 20 seconds, and you spoke to that person, and what is it that would strike as this one? Maybe I might want to have a second conversation. That's 20 minutes.
Well, number one, he or she must understand what the role is all about. Because if I have to explain to this candidate what the role is all about, then perhaps this person is not really interested. And number two, having understood the role, what is it that he or she can give to the institution? Why do I say this? Because I've had the unfortunate experience of bringing in someone from one of the big banks, an international bank. And on paper, she had the right credentials, right exposure. But unfortunately, it was too big of a step for her, because at the international bank, it was a plug and play situation, because everything was, scripted. You just have to go in, do what you are told to do or supposed to do, and everything falls into place. In a DFI, in some DFIs, not all DFIs, I know some DFIs have fantastic sort of processes and things like that, but in other DFIs, we still have a lot of work to do in terms of improving the way we do things. And she couldn't sort of, step up to provide guidance to the team to help fix what had to be fixed. And she kept, unfortunately, bringing up the issue of how all these things were, within inverted commas, broken, how things at this other bank were perfect, and so on and so forth. So I keep telling candidates, especially senior candidates, that when we bring you in, we expect you to inject new ideas and guide people that you are being brought in to lead, as opposed to expecting the bank to give everything to you on a silver platter, because that essentially is what leadership is all about: taking charge, fixing what needs to be fixed, and giving your team members the confidence and the guidance to do what they perhaps thought they couldn't do.
One last question before we wrap up, because we've gone past our time. Tan Sri Azhar said yesterday, political climate in Malaysia, and not specifically in Malaysia, but many countries, will see regular change in leaderships, governments and leadership. That's not ideal for business. Business wants stability. Investors want stability and certainty. I know this is a long answer, but I'm pleading for a short, succinct answer. How in your view, what are the preparations that businesses in Malaysia, specifically DFIs, must start doing, in your view, to prepare for this new landscape, new realities, as it were?
Well, I perhaps should start by saying that the instability, I hate it. But it is what it is. It's a reality that we are facing today. It's important to understand the purpose of your organization. It's important to incorporate that purpose. Of course, every DFI was set up with a specific purpose in mind. But over time, that purpose might have been diluted. So for those DFIs where the purpose might have been diluted over the years, or where the purpose is not as obvious as it should be, I think that's the first thing that the management needs to do. Take a step back, focus on what the purpose of the establishment of the DFI was. Ask yourselves, are we still committed to that purpose? If you are, fantastic. If you're not, or if there is some sort of ambiguity, then re-establish the purpose. And if, of course, everything else is what the management will do to drive business and things like that. But if your purpose is clear, then regardless of who's in power, I think it'll be very easy for the powers that be to understand why your organization is important and remains relevant.
It's a very good answer, actually. So, Arshad, I just want to wrap up by saying we started with your childhood and then your journey through your professional trajectory, touched on some parts of career, even the relevance of DFI, which was very useful. You made a very good argument that DFIs are still relevant to Malaysian society. And then also the role of governance and board. I'm going to end with a rapid round. I'll put a word to you and then what comes to mind immediately. 4 or 5. Jeddah.
Sorry?
Jeddah.
Jeddah. Wonderful place.
Dubai. You worked there, right?
Yes, I did. It was a particularly prolific sort of a period in my career.
One word answers.
I
No sentences.
I can't do one word answers. I cannot.
This is the problem with bankers. One word. Financial institutions.
We need them.
Legacy.
We have to deal with legacies.
Crisis management.
I can't do one word. When it comes to crisis management, maybe you can't prepare, but trust me, you can manage crisis. You just need to sort of approach it with a calm head, get the right people around you, and you will be able to manage a crisis.
Faith.
Okay, that's a crisis.
Faith.
Faith is very important. I think if you remain sort of true to the principles of your faith, then what you do in your business environment will be the right thing for the organization and for you.
Food.
Moderation.
Coffee.
Absolutely.
I'm just going to read you this and then ask you the final reflection. This is by Emma Bombach. She's a poet. When I stand before God at the end of my life, I would hope that I would not have a single bit of talent left. And I could say I used everything you gave me. Is there a talent, if there was one, that you have not used yet for the betterment of humanity?
I don't have too many talents.
But if there was one you had still, only you would know, that you could still utilize for the betterment of humanity. Name one.
I wish I could be a better mentor. I wish I could help more professionals in the context of the banking world. I wish I could help more younger professionals become better banking professionals or better professionals in general. So that's one talent which I wish I could develop for the betterment of people I come into contact with.
Asha, I'm sure you've already done that and on your way of doing. On that note, thank you very much, everyone. And for Arshad, Assalamu alaikum.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Miss Fairuz, and thank you once again to Yang Berbahagia Encik Arshad Muhammad Ismail, President CEO at Zimbank Malaysia Berhad. Please remain on the stage for Encik Arshad as I'm inviting Yang Berbahagia Encik Izwan Zainuddin to present the memento to our honorable speaker, please. Congratulations, thank you once again to Yang Berbahagia Encik Arshad Muhammad Ismail, and thank you to Encik Izwan Zainuddin, Chairman of ArtFilm, for presenting the memento, please. Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a quick break, toilet break, refreshment break for about 15 minutes. For 10:30, we're going to have our next panel discussion. So ladies and gentlemen, please have your morning break, your refreshment. You can also bring inside the foods and also coffee or tea. All right? Thank you very much. Please be right back in this hall at 10:30 a.m. Thank you. SMI. Our next panelist is Ms. Namita Vikas, founder Autos ESG India. And last but not least, let's put our hand together to Tuan Syed Alwi Muhammad Sultan, CEO UMP Holdings. Let us give a few more minutes, few more moments to have all the delegates to come inside the hall. We already have our moderator. Meanwhile, waiting for our delegates, ladies and gentlemen, let us get to know our moderator as well as the panelists. Our moderator is Ms. Fairuz Abdul Hamid. She is an adjunct professor, Unitar International University, with over 30 years of experience in public and private sector, as well as academia. Ms. Fairuz's experience range from strategy, transformation, innovation, communications, reputation management, crisis management, governance and democracy, business and human rights, as well as sustainability. She has worked in several countries. She obtained 2 degrees from Imperial College of Science and Technology of London, qualified chartered engineer in the United Kingdom, and Ms. Fairuz received an MBA from Imperial College in London as well. Ms. Fairuz is also a writer. She is currently an adjunct professor at Unitar International for Institutional Reform and Transformation. Throughout his career journey, Ms. Fairuz managed to interview many key leaders and politicians. Our first panel, Mr. George Taitim Tulas, Chief Executive Officer, Sabah Credit Corporation. who has won CEO of the Year last night. Mr. Josh Tatum is the Chief Executive Officer of Sabah Credit Corporation. He served Sabah Credit Corporation for 26 years, and during that period, he held several senior management positions such as Head of Information Technology Department, Head of Human Resource Department, Head of Corporate Training Department, and Chief Financial Officer before assuming the main position of CEO. He is an active Rotarian under the Rotary Club of Kota Kinabalu for the past 11 years. He is also an active member of the Sabah Computer Society and has served as president for 16 years from 1996 to 2012. Our second panelist is Mrs. Sylvie Jegani, Director of Financing and Investment of PTSMI. She is an Indonesian citizen based in Indonesia. Sylvie Jegani obtained her Master of Business Administration in Banking and Finance from University of Indonesia in 2001 and attended the Accelerated Universal Banking Program at Nanyang Technological University, NTU, Singapore in 2012 to 2013. She earned her Bachelor of Chemical Engineering from Bandung Institute of Technology in 1995. Previously, she served as Head of Resource Energy and Infrastructure at Australian and New Zealand Banking Group, Director of Natural Resources Group Indonesia at Australia and New Zealand Banking Group, Team Head of Mining and Energy Group at Bank CIMB Niaga, Vice President for Corporate Banking Group at Bank CIMB Niaga, Relationship Manager of Loan Workout Division at Indonesia Bank Restructuring Agency, and Assistant Manager of Investment Banking and Department at Ficor Invest Bank. She was then appointed as Director of PTSMI since March 23, 2020, and as Financing and Investment Director, she is responsible for managing the company's funds and investments and monitoring facilities as well as administrative and custodial activities. Our third panel is Ms. Namita Vikas. Ms. Namita Vikas is currently the founder and managing director of Auctus ESG LLP, a global firm providing strategic advisory on sustainable finance, climate transition, ESG, and climate risk management. An award-winning senior business leader with over 30 years of diverse global experience in sustainable finance, ESG, and climate strategy across banking and technology. In her previous leadership role with a large Indian private bank, she led the maiden issuance of a green bond, launched many innovative first-of-its-kind sustainable finance product. She was also instrumental in raising over USD 1 billion in green capital from marquee global DFIs. Since 2020, she has steered marquee global projects awarded by international governments, UN agencies, and global DFIs at Auctus ESG. Last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, yang berbahagia Tuan Syed Alwi Muhammad Sultan. He is a CEO of UMP Holdings, and Tuan Syed Alwi is an experienced C-suite executive with more than 24 years of professional experience across the financial services industry. His vast experience includes exposure in consulting, technology, and banking organizations in Malaysia, Bahrain, and Singapore. He was previously the President cum Chief Executive Officer of Agrobank and the Managing Director of Islamic Finance at BNP Paribas. He has a bachelor degree in accountancy and MBA in Islamic Finance from IIUM. Syed Alwi also a qualified FinTech program certificate from Oxford University and currently pursuing his PhD with University Malaya on the topic of sustainable banking. That's it, a bit of background of our moderator and panelists. So, to the moderator and panelists, we have a double ring sound, double bell sound. Can we demonstrate? Double bell sound. It's okay. To indicate another 10 minutes left for you to wrap up the session. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, the Roaring 2020s, a way forward. Miss Fairuz, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum again, and a very good morning still again. The UK saw 3 prime ministers over the course of 24 months. We saw 2 leading female leaders, Jacinda Ardern and Nicola Sturgeon of Scotland, resign. We saw 4 prime ministers in Malaysia in the last 4 years. We are also seeing earthquakes, sadly, in Turkey, and many other countries. Tragedies abound. The question is for business. You had a strategy, you had a scenario upon which you built your strategies. Is that really relevant still? I'm actually quite nervous because with me today are 4 distinguished panelists. So the format for today will be as follows. We have an hour and a half. I've been strictly told an hour and a half. So each one of the panelists will be given about 12 minutes max to present your case, and it's up to you how you present your case. And then we'll do prompted questions, followed by questions from the floor. So can I start with Namita to present her case? Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Firoz, for the start of the session. And can we have the slides, please? Do you have the slides? Okay, thank you. So, yeah, just as an introduction and to what our moderator said, I think, the early part of the 21st century has been a kind of a mixed bag. On one hand, it signified a decade of economic growth and prosperity with technology and innovation growing, while the great financial crises of 2008 and the COVID provided kind of headwinds. The current decade of 2020s is seeing an increased uncertainty looming over businesses, investments, and the growth curves. Maybe the pandemic, which induced the meltdown, post-pandemic economic recovery, rising inflation, and growing geopolitical tensions. In an increasingly polarized world, the ripple effects have led to a kind of a VUCA situation. And along with these kind of complexities, there is climate change and there is climate action that's required, coupled by the pressures of the capital requirements towards decarbonizing economies, the net zero future that we are talking about. And all this is proving to be quite challenging. And amid all this downturn, how do economies really navigate and recover? What are the short and long-term mega trends, and how do we adapt, transform, and become resilient? Some important questions of this defining decade. Let's go on to the next slide to see what are the mega trends driving the market. So if you look at the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report of 2023, it provides a comprehensive perspective of the major threats that may impact global prosperity in the near term and over the next decade. In response to the recent times, there is an evolving focus on finding out how, when, and by how much will these risks impact businesses. And as you see on the left side of the screen, the report lists climate and environmental related issues amongst the 5 of the top 6 risks by severity in the long term. And in the near term, that is the 2-year period, issues like failure to mitigate and adapt to climate change, extreme weather events, and natural resource crises feature prominently in this survey. And in addition, the social mega trends like large-scale migration, inequality, income inequalities, growing informalization of labor are also pressing forward. Next slide, please. In response to all of this, at COP26, it was a kind of a turning point with the Glasgow Climate Pact, which explicitly planned to phase out or phase down coal use, right, fossil fuel use, and also inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. We also saw countries like India, China, Malaysia stepping forward to take net zero targets. A series of commitments to various mitigation and adaptation efforts was seen across the Asian region, and there were commitments to there were pledges to cut down methane, for example, or to fully or partially bring the coal consumption down. In the financial sector, the GFANZ emerged as the most comprehensive platform for implementation of decarbonization strategies. And the GFANZ is supported by about 550 entities representing over $130 trillion in assets. There is also a dedicated GFANZ in APAC, which is out of Singapore. And this is for more and more banks to commit to net zero and have implementation plans. Now, post the COP26, countries also ratified their NDCs and their long-term strategies around clean transition, energy transition, bringing down the carbon footprint from carbon-intensive sectors, so on and so forth. But I think, the question remains is, how do we move on from the what to the how? How do banks, how do financial institutions actually undertake this, right? If we could go to the next slide, please. So one must understand the different pressures at the market level. So the global scenario impacts stakeholders, including customers, investors, regulators, which in turn impacts markets and businesses. So for instance, mounting international pressures from regulations, especially from unseemingly unconnected quarters like carbon pricing, or the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, or the regulation that's now in Malaysia on climate risk management, the policy. I think all this have a kind of a knock-on effect on markets in terms of the costs and the competitiveness, especially for carbon-intensive product services. Also, those financial institutions that are financing this. So that's very important to understand. And similarly, the changing profile of clients is also posing a risk to business. I mean, more and more millennials and young people are asking for sustainable products, and they're moving towards, they're asking if companies have sustainable policies, so on and so forth. And then if you look at within the financial sector, global DFIs, institutional investors, these are all demanding an alignment with sustainability criteria, right? I mean, we've seen the pressures recently on Shell by its investors and shareholders because of certain climate mismanagement disclosures. Greenwashing, I think that's one of the big elephants in the room, and that's catching up because there are regulations coming against it. Hong Kong, Singapore, they've asked for clear ESG product labeling and disclosures. And with increased regulator, customer and investor stakeholder involvement and pressures on both the social as well as the business aspects, the environmental sides or the business aspects, all this is stacking up very high to define a different kind of market competitiveness in the decade ahead. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to put out this slide to put out the possible scenarios. And there are two extremes within this, right? I mean, there is one term which is business as usual, and then there is a net zero scenarios. And the central question for all of us here is how to align business and financial portfolios to such scenarios so that we emerge climate smart, at the same time maintain market competitiveness. And moving away from traditional risk return model, therefore becomes very, very important for financial institutions and to emerge and set a kind of a new paradigm. However, when you look within banks, there's lack of capacity, lack of resources, lack of access to capital, and all this limits our actions in aligning with suitable scenarios within the net zero transition. The idea of sustainability as a constraint to development has also given way to serious and multiple challenges. So again, the question is, how do you balance economic growth with low carbon transition with all these limitations that we see? Next slide, please. I want to just put out the transformation that we are seeing as far as the financial landscape is concerned. And in line with the evolving changes that businesses face, the finance sector is rapidly changing. I mean, you're seeing the change in each country or at a regional level, right? And this is really categorized into three buckets. The first is grading of the financial system by integrating ESG and climate smart practices within risk management and investment appraisal. And we heard some bankers yesterday who are doing it very effectively. This primarily on account of regulatory pressures at one level. There is a lot of synchronization because of taxonomies that have evolved, stricter climate regimes that have come up. From a capital raising perspective or an allocation standpoint, also there's tremendous pressure, and there are checks that are being done by financial institutions now in terms of where they are providing the capital and whether that's being aligned to, say, a Paris goal or the net zero by a particular country. And to this end, there are also patchy disclosures which are fast being replaced by frameworks like TCFD. This is one, to assess financial implications of climate risks and opportunities, and two, to test organizational resilience to climate risks that go beyond the typical business planning cycles. Green asset tagging is something that you may have heard, where, you know, a country like Indonesia has started to tag the ministry budgets to identify project expenditure that can help meet climate objectives. Then there's financing of green, or the development of financial instruments to fund sustainable sectors or projects. I mean, we've seen the green bond market grow, the green, sustainable and social market grow, or other labeled issuances grow. We've seen ASEAN, there are many issuances on sustainability, sustainability-linked bonds or sustainability-linked products, where the products which are more flexible and they're aligned to the sustainability KPI. We expect these kind of products to grow more and more. And then there's also momentum on transition finance, which is to decarbonize sectors within certain markets. I think the third is financing of green or greening of finance. The intersection that is at green finance and technology, I think that's also assuming a lot of importance. Yesterday, we heard many speakers talk about digitalization to facilitate payments maybe, or to access credit, or within investment products. So there are examples across the region where, particularly targeting SME sectors or marginalized communities or nature-based sectors, enabling more liquidity and tradability. So these are some of the factors where, the approaches are moving from just risk return to risk return impact, and in a way safeguarding against future risks and leveraging new opportunities within emerging markets and also within Asia. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to put out this slide, given that we have a combination here of DFIs, Islamic financing institutions. So I wanted to put out the kind of opportunities that lie alongside of Islamic finance and ESG. So since there are the convergence of ESG and Islamic finance, with both markets to grow. So ESG assets market is to grow within the next 2 years at $53 trillion, and Islamic finance would grow at about $3 trillion. So if ESG has so many commonalities with Islamic finance, then I think it should at least grow more than 20%, I would think. So what are the overlaps? So one is accountability, transparency, and legal protection. Second is promotion of equality, social justice, and economic prosperity in society and operations. And the third is promotion of environmental protection and resource conservation. Holds good possibility of merging Islamic finance products such as Sharia compliant sukuk bonds and funds into the portfolios of ESG focused investors worldwide. Now the difference is that to bridge, our ESG is focused on creating sustainability through investor company engagement, whereas Islamic finance focuses on rule-based avoidance of harm. On the other side, the differing approaches to investment screening, ESG investors look at inclusivity while Islamic finance looks at exclusionary screening. I think to tap into these opportunities, it's important to consider the underlying sensitivities in the form of investing that would make this conversion more recognizable and trusted. And we've seen, for example, in Malaysia, since we are sitting in Kuala Lumpur right now, the first green sukuk in the world that raised 250 million Malaysian ringgits. It financed solar, and there were today, Malaysia itself has 12 green sukuks, 2 social bonds, and 3 sustainability bonds. There are issuances that we've seen by Saudi National Bank, by the Riyadh Bank, as well as green sukuk banks by the First Abu Dhabi Bank. And I think there's so much of potential combining regulatory efforts. All of this data is serving as a proof that Islamic finance market is an important means to transform the financial landscape in this decade. Next and the last slide. So supplementing the financial ecosystem is very essential, and to be able to set the wheels for climate transition in motion. I think climate risk is quantitative and complex, and therefore skill enhancement on ESG climate sustainability risks is particularly important to understand that risk return approach or the risk return perspective that banks have. It implies skill enhancement at a systemic, institutional and individual level. Systemic is board of directors, C-suite. I think it starts from the top, right? At an organizational level, to view these aspects from a cross-organizational requirement versus just a departmental responsibility. I think that's very important. So incorporating sustainability and climate into corporate governance, internal controls, adopting appropriate policies, building expertise in implementing risk management frameworks, and performing regular internal reviews. This would really ensure that we bring about this space together, innovating products and services and getting buy-in from the board and the senior management. I think all of this plays a very, very important role in this whole roaring 2020s that we're talking about. In summary, next slide, please. The ESG megatrends upon us, stringency, focus, expectations for regulations on climate and sustainability, all these are bound to increase. This makes action an absolute necessity for sustaining business and financing portfolios within emerging markets. Backed by ambitious targets, capacity building policies, I think there is now a need to roll out a kind of a strategy which integrates climate or ESG social aspects right at the beginning. And we firmly believe that this will transform businesses and financial markets and set a tone for the 20s of this century. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Namita. Do you want to... So, before we move on to the next speaker, just a few points from your presentation. In light of the mega trends that you've just shown, what are the steps that DFIs should be taking? Yeah. And how should they evolve on association such as ATFIM? How must they evolve? And then also, we see multiple headwinds from your presentation. In what situations, what are some of the key areas that FIs need to be aware of in developing their strategies? Particularly, I was interested in your chart, which showed resource depletion, where there was voluntary and involuntary migration. How, in your view, does that impact your final slide, which you showed augmentation of human capital? How does the migration affect that? And then you spoke, I know it's like a slew of questions here. And then you spoke about greenwashing, decarbonization strategies, net zero targets. But we know that the Ukraine war has developed blocks in the globally, the pro-Ukraine war and the non-pro-Ukraine war. And within that, those who are enhancing fossil fuel activities and those who are keeping to that. So the question is, can targets be maintained in such a scenario? And then finally, places like Malaysia are often, I know you mentioned some greenwashing and certain ESG issues. Places like Malaysia are affected by business and human rights issues. Okay, so some of our manufacturing businesses have been subjected to sanctions in some parts of the world, and this affects financial institutions that finance these businesses. How do we deal with issues like that from the perspective of human migration, and how we deal with TIPS, by the way, is transportation in person, trafficking in person of human. And at the moment, there is about 20 million people trafficked illegally globally, either sexually assaulted or sold. And Malaysia does not come up very well in that list currently. For instance, I'm sure there's a long list. TIPS is a US-based listing of trafficking in persons and where we rank as countries. So for you to think about while George speaks. Yeah, we'll come back to you when everyone's spoken, and then we'll discuss the questions. George, over to you.
Yeah, thank you to our moderator. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, for the session that we have, obviously it's very interesting sessions. What more, today, just now we had a sharing from our fellow panelists, and we talk about the global scenarios. Yeah, the global scenarios. Yesterday, we had a session with our Tan Sri Azahar that bringing us to the real scenario, where we are, what we should be looking into, and things in terms of human bias as a CEOs and what. This morning we have a session with Arshad, the CEO of Exim Bank, and that is talking about the challenge of the CEO of today. Yeah. So this morning our moderator started with how many changes in prime ministers, right? And I can tell you honestly, where I came from, Sabah, just the north part of Borneo Island. For those who's not in Malaysia, it used to be known as the North Borneo. I think in England they still call it, they still remember it as North Borneo, not Sabah. I say, for being 30 years working with Sabah Trade Corporations, not 26, and on for more years there. So I have had many change in chief ministers that I serve with. I think maybe triple or quadruple of what Malaysia have, or for that matter, even what United Kingdom went through. Again, the changes and these leaders does bear a lot of consequences on the organization that we are running. But if I must say, for 68 years operating in the surface of the world, Sabah Credit must have something right that they did for us to be able to be here until now and still managing well and still growing as usual and still being able to serve our mandate. Our mandate is very simple: to help the state government in uplifting the social economic of the Malaysian in Sabah through easy access of financing. It's a very good mandate. Even when we start, we even loan people to buy buffaloes. That was in 1955. And there wasn't even maybe tractors on that point of time. But if you talk about social economy, you talk about the people, And as we go along, we even at point of time, the local authority is the one that processing our loan and approving our loan. We only given the task to disburse the loan and to recover the loan. It's really hell things, if I can gauge it from the senior colleagues of mine who has retired a few years ago. you know. And they're talking about people who doesn't know what is MPL is all about. Yeah, people who doesn't, they're not being measured in what is the performance of the loan, but our organization is the one being measured given the KPI. As we go along, that because we belong wholly to the state government, we have our core business and just being snapped away without giving us reason what is it all about, why this happened like that. And it gave us another challenge. Yeah, give us another challenge, whether we want to continue growing, whether we want to continue operating, or die naturally, because there wasn't any inflow on funding from the state government, for that matter. Yeah, but thankfully enough, we have friends in the banking areas who come to us and say, "Hey, why not you raise your fund from the capital market?" So they hold our hands and bring us to the capital market. That is where we are today. We source our fund from the capital market. We raise bond and sukuks, and we have some facilities from the bank. So that brings Sabah Credit into the global arena, where we have to subscribe to these global issues of certification of things. You must giving like this. You must follow this policy. You must follow these procedures. So this is a big challenge for Sabah Credit while trying to adhere to the global policies. Yeah, we are thinking about our kampong people, our the people in our rural areas. And for the information of everybody, it is not a secret that Sabah, my state, in Malaysia, is still the highest poverty level in Malaysia. Even after we joining Malaysia for so many years, we're supposed to be the rich state. We have oil, we have timber, we have a lot of minerals, but we are still the poorest state. We still have a lot of poverties in Sabah. So it gives us a challenge as an organization to listen to what the world or the global needs us to do in order, because we are involved in the capital market, you know, and at the same time, how to actually train or even teach our people to be sustainable, especially in the rural areas, who doesn't know anything about climate change, yeah, who doesn't know anything about the greenhouse or whatsoever policies, yeah, who just want to have food on their plates every day. I grew up as a kampong boy and a village boy. The time when I was young, growing up happily in a kampong, hunger is not in my vocabulary. But today things change. Today things change. Yeah. It's no longer as it was before. Yeah. So the challenge is becoming more and more towards the CEO, how you strategize moving forward in this roaring 2020. Indeed, it is roaring 2020. If you just look into what we started with 2020, the COVID, once you start recovering from the COVID, then now we are potentially faced with the problems of global inflations, the geopolitics here, who's the superpowers here, the super economies here. But we, for Sabah Credit, it's just a very little thing in certain part of the world that people may not even know. But what about Malaysia? Do we have the biggest say? No. If a company, if an organization or if a country can just say, I freeze your asset if you don't follow this. I give you a sanction on this if you follow this. Is it right? Okay, I'm not an activist to start with, but I'm a bit more conservative because I grew up with the people in the rural areas. I know what's in it. But here, would you be able to fulfill what is the requirement of the global requirement? At the same time, to match with what is the need of our people in Sabah, especially rural areas. Yep. So, with this big challenge, we have a reality as what our Tan Sri Azhar said, and versus idealists. But this is the reality of it. We have to face it. We have to deal with it. Yeah. So to me, whatever strategies that you do, whatever scenarios that you try to put in your organization, as long as you don't have the say, it will be very, very difficult for us to implement it. Yeah. So I try to look inward myself in my organization as a CEO. I'll be telling my staff, we must have the wisdom. There's no need to have a big project, to have a big one. But most important thing, as a leader, as a CEO, we must have the wisdom to know what we should do, not to be greedy, at the same time not to sit down and enjoy the perks that the CEO receives. No? To know what is right, to know what is good for us first. It's no. To me, there's no point of bringing up all these things to our country if the people is still suffering. Our moderator mentioned about the issue in Ukraine. You talk about fossil fuels. You talk about Europe is going back to coal. And they were the one that's signing the treaties of all these things, that green technologies or whatsoever. Yep. So am I going to say that, yes, we have to enforce the global what on this? No. They know what is right for them. So they resort to fuel, to fossil fuel. Yeah. Can we blame them? I think they know what they're doing. They're using their wisdom, I would say. Obviously, as a leader, we have to have the courage to say yes and no. Whatever is right, then we say yes. Whatever is wrong, then we say no. Whatever suits us, then we say that's what we're going to be. And whatever no, once we're not right to us, they said, sorry, we are not going to deal with it. Yeah. Obviously, we need to have the temperance. Yeah. And lastly, as a leader of CEO, as a CEO of any organization, we must have, to me, the justice. Yeah. Not only justice to our own people, but also justice to other people that we deal with, to all around the world. Yeah. For that nature, yes, I would say the challenge, the issue of Roaring 2020, the way forward, is not so much on what are the scenarios that we need to do and what are the projects that we need to do, what is our strategies, but to look back into our own surface as a leader, as a CEO. Do we have that wisdom? Do you practice that wisdom? Do you have that courage? Do you have that temperance? Do you have that justice in look at? Yeah. Then only we can set up a right strategy. Maybe not for the whole world, but what is right for us first. We sort out our house first. Yep. So once we have done that, then obviously we can look into what is next to us. What is that? So this is what Sabah Credit has been doing for the last 68 years, but still, obviously, with all the limitations, with all the challenges that we face, with realizing whatever the global world, the global setup, like what being discussed or what being presented by our colleague Namita just now, yeah, that is real. That is what needed for. But would that be real in our own perspective if we look inwards? Can we do that? As what Azhar said, is it the real one or is it the populist one? Yeah. Personally, when I look into my personal, I mean, this is my own personal view on what's happening today. Europe, Russia, China, America, Ukraine. It's not about the war. It's about the strategy of making who is stronger. Yeah. Somebody pushed Russia to go into war with Ukraine. That's my own view. Making Russia possibly worsen the economy, right? And then stop Russia supplying energy to Europe, right? And get Russia to buy energy from them at 4 times the price of what Russia can supply to them. Yeah. Put sanction to China here and there and here and there. You know? So if all the countries want, then the economy is better. Yeah. So this is my view on things. I'm sorry if I hope I'm wrong, but that is my personal view. So if you said I'm wrong, yes, it's my own personal view. Yeah, it's not the global view or what. This is what I interpret what's happening in the world today. So it's not longer about peace in the world. It's no longer about communities, economics. What? It's about superpower. It's about who hold the better economy. So that the rest will be depending on this, the one that have this, the hole on it. Yeah. Okay. For us, I think the view, my personal view, yes, we have to understand what the global is actually setting up, whether they are actually honestly doing it for the sake of the world, yeah, or there's some bigger agenda in it, you know, and whether we should, or how we should manage it or fit it to our own scenario, our own perspective. So I think a lot of things have changed going through 68, not 30 years in Sabah Credit. Last time we were told that how many projects have you done to assist the people? As we go along, then I have this on how much money you're making. How much money you're making.
George, I think you've passed the 10 minutes.
All right.
Thank you.
So I'll end up here. But for those who want to what, you can always chat with me privately.
Thank you. Thank you very much, George. A round of applause, please, for George. George, thank you so much. Again, a couple of questions that comes to mind. Sabah produces about 40% of Malaysia's crude oil, correct? But it also has Malaysia's highest poverty rate, right? So how do we reconcile that? An oil-rich state that has the highest poverty rate. And so what is the federal government and the state government getting wrong in this view? I mean, an oil-rich state that has the highest poverty rate. And then number two, are handouts like putting in 500 ringgit in EPF accounts, that's our Providence Fund, for example, for the overseas delegates, help alleviate poverty? And if so, what are the sorts of specific actions, if you could name one or two, that state or federal government should be doing and are not doing? Okay, on that note, Tuan Alwi, first. You want to go first? Or Sylvie, are you ready to go? Yeah, okay, Sylvie.
Do I have a slide? Okay. Okay. Next page, please. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sylvia. I'm Director of Financing and Investment of PT SMI, Development Financial Institution, wholly owned by Ministry of Finance from Indonesia. So okay. So yes, this page, I believe that you all must be aware of the challenge that we are currently facing and is happening, that we have the global supply disruption, global supply chain disruption, we have the geopolitical tension, we have the rising inflation everywhere, and some of the central banks has also increased their policy rate to cope with this inflation. Next page, please. So the global economy is forecasted to keep on the recovery path in 2023. However, we are still have to dealing with the inflation risk, which is further, I think it will tightening the monetary policy and also hindering the economic recovery. Indonesia in 2022, the growth is pretty well, 5.3%. But given that what the global condition, we forecasted that the growth will be slightly decreased this year in 4.8%. Next page, please. So inflation rate is forecasted to slow down in 2023 as a result of the increased policy rate, which leads to a less aggressive policy rate increase compared to 2022. However, in first quarter this year, 2023, we see that U.S. economy is not slowing down. So the inflation rate is going down a bit, but it's still above the expected inflation rate. As a result, that we are expecting the policy rate will further increase this year, which, yeah, it's going to be a challenge factor for the economic development everywhere as well. Next page. Commodity price will normalize, we expect, in 2023 compared to 2022. As effect from the Russia-Ukraine war starts to diminish, then we have to watch this out, the development. Hope there will be no geopolitical tension which will increase another commodity price. Next. Yeah, despite the global uncertainty that we are facing in 2022, 2023, Indonesia economy still managed grow at the pre-COVID level of 5% year-on-year in 2022, while inflation rate was significantly lower than developed countries such as US, UK, and European. So in 2022, the inflation rate in Indonesia is 5.5%. Economic growth is 5.5%. We even reached 5.7% in the second quarter, supported by Ramadan and Idul Fitri, which is at the pre-pandemic level. Sectors, you can see here, the sector is highly impacted during the pandemic is accommodation and food beverage, tourism, transportation. After the pandemic, on the recovery, we see that this sectors has been recovered. Next page. As economy recover, liquidity in the banking sector is decreasing, indicating by loan growth higher than deposit growth. However, the economic activity is not back to the pandemic level, given the loan to deposit ratio is actually still below the pre-pandemic level, which actually reached almost more than 90%. Next. So infrastructure development play an important role in Indonesia to support the economic growth, and especially during the recession. Government is still actually spending for the infrastructure development. And as you can see, the result, the correlation between infrastructure index and development is positive. Infrastructure index and the gross domestic regional product actually has a positive correlation. Infrastructure development is actually can manage to hold the growth rate, especially on the region, not to fall further. Infrastructure index versus the human development index is also have the correlation, positive correlation, where infrastructure has an impact to the human capital, positive impact, and infrastructure index versus the poverty level has the negative correlation, means that infrastructure actually reducing the poverty. Next. Just to give you a little bit background on PTSMI. PTSMI is the only special mission vehicle of the Indonesian government responsible to accelerate the infrastructure development in Indonesia. This is our mandate, accelerating infrastructure development in Indonesia. So we wholly owned by the Ministry of Finance, and the product actually span from the equity investment to loan. We provide financing not only for private sector, but also to the public sector, municipal financing. We have conventional loan and Sharia loan, and so on and so forth. Next page, please. So these are the role of PTSMI in the financing of national infrastructure development. We provide innovative and creative financing model. We provide municipal financing, which is actually one of the tools the government used during the pandemic as the counter-cyclical tools. We have also equity investment. Then we also assign by the government to support the government program in sustainable development and also for energy transition. Next please. Okay, so this is the task given by the government in 2020 and 2021 to PTSMI as the SMV or Special Mission Vehicles, where actually the government used PTSMI as a counter-cyclical tools. As you know, during the pandemic, consumption decreased, investment also declining, and the only tools that can support the economic growth or not to fall further is the fiscal. So the government during the pandemic still supporting the infrastructure development, especially on the regional area, in order to still create jobs and to boost the economic activity. And for that counter-cyclical tools, SMI which actually was mandated by the government to provide almost 40 trillion rupiah to almost 100 regional government in providing loan, or we call it some of them coming from the fiscal, we call it the government investment. We call government investment because it has to be repaid back in certain years, less than 8 years. And some of the financing coming from the PTSMI funding. We also supporting government as the trusting agent for the providing the investment to SOE, the important and strategic SOE, so they will not fall further as a Garuda Indonesia, the flight carrier. So we can see now the Garuda is still flying to the Kereta Api, the train, national train, which the performance now has been back to the pre-pandemic level, and also the steel company. So other than PTSMI, government is also assigned other special mission vehicle to manage the housing company, national company, and also SOE who provide food security. Next, please. So PTSMI also, as a DFI, also appointed by the government as a platform for Sustainable Development Goals, SDG Indonesia 1, where all the financing or funding to support SDG project in Indonesia, whether it is coming from public or private, is actually channeling through PTSMI. So currently, there are about 3 billion commitment coming from international, multilateral, international banks, philanthropies, and some of them has been deployed to support the SDG projects such as hospital in the region, water and sanitation project, and so on and so forth. Next, please. And last but not least, SMI just appointed by the government last year during the G20 presidency to be the country platform, national country platform for energy transition. As you might know that Indonesia pledged to achieve their NDC unconditionally, reducing emission by 41% in 2030 and net zero by 2050. So to achieve that, we get the support from international lenders, public and private. So that's why the government actually established or appoint SMI to be the country platform to manage the funding and also to manage the investment plan for the energy transition, provided to National Electricity Company, PLN, and also IPP to help them to reduce carbon emission. I think that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. A round of applause, Mr. Wee. Can somebody put up the first slide from Sylvie's presentation, please? Sylvie, on your first slide, you mentioned global supply chain. It's the first slide again. Yeah, and how it can cause disruption, and then you linked it back to the war. How much of the supply chain disruption can cause infrastructure projects, your planned infrastructure projects, and how much of the raw material that Indonesia is using is local and then foreign? And how does that affect targets that Indonesia set? And then what could change those targets? And then also it has a knock-on effect on the society that you're trying to bring up to a certain level, right? Human capital, human index that you talk about. And then finally, you speak of carbon targets, yeah, NDCs. What sort of scenarios could change those targets? Okay, on that note, Tuan Alwi, to close it. And then we will go back to the questions that we've asked. If we have time, we'll ask questions from the audience because it's already almost 11:30.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and a very good morning. Thank you, Dr. Fairuz. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It gives me great pleasure to be part of this prestigious event and also to be part of an illustrious panel of speakers. Being in this conference reminds me of a light anecdote, if I can just share this experience. There was a conference where a speaker who was very passionate about his topic, and the moment you gave him the microphone, the moment he came on stage, he continued to speak, look at his slides, look at the screen, and he continued to speak on his topic. After about half an hour, the crowd got a bit bored and about half of the room started trickling out. But he continued with his topic because he was so passionate about it. He continued for another hour. And by the time he finished his session, he looked up, the entire room was deserted. Everyone had left, except for one person who was sitting right at the end of the hall. And he looked up and he said, "With that, I conclude my presentation." And he looked at that person and he was, "My God, thank you." Just where Badri is sitting, "Thank you for staying throughout this session. Can I know who you are?" And that person got up from the end of the room. He said, "I am the next speaker." So I'm glad that we don't have that situation. We have an excellent moderator who's controlling the time. I got a bit worried with George just now. He almost got into that situation, but thanks, Dr. Fairuz. And if I see anyone walking out, I'll stop my session. I know I'm being boring. Ladies and gentlemen, I like to start with another quote by Bob Hope, the US comedian, who said about banks. He said, "Banks will lend you money if you can prove that you don't need it." This quote, though in jest and in comic relief, reflects that banks have always been seen with skeptical eyes. And this has not been helped by the various financial crises that banks have caused. But ever since the 2008 global financial crisis and the Sustainable Development Goals that came into effect in 2015, the global financial industry is reinventing or trying to reinvent itself under the umbrella of sustainable finance. Yeah, sustainable finance is basically how financial activities such as lending, loans, financing, investments take into consideration environmental, societal, and governance factors, in addition to profit considerations. So sometimes they call it the triple bottom line. Sometimes they call it various other acronyms. But that's what sustainable finance is all about. And the poster child of sustainable finance was mentioned by some of our speakers, is the green bond. You even have blue bond. You even have impact bond. And in the Islamic finance world, you have the green sukuk products. That's the poster child that we always that we are always exposed to, all right? But on the retail side of banks, and most of you on the development side, also do sustainable finance products. For example, there are banks who offer green mortgages. Green mortgages in some countries, I don't think in Malaysia it's offered in this manner, but there are other ways that they're offered. Banks will offer financing or loans for customers who are purchasing mortgages at a lower rate than a normal market mortgage rate if the customer upgrades the house to energy efficient appliances, for instance. So if the house is energy efficient, if it is green, then banks offer a lower rate than normal market rate. So that's considered green mortgage. There are also affinity cards that credit card companies or banks offer. Affinity cards works in such a way that the income generated from the credit card will be shared, a portion of the income will be shared to NGOs or charitable organizations. When I was in Bank Muamalat a couple of years back, many years back in fact, Bank Muamalat introduced the world's first Waqaf debit card, which means all the income that the bank receives from customers swiping the debit card, a portion of it will be given to Waqaf organizations. And that hence became the world's first Waqaf debit card. So these are some of the instances of products that we can see, and there are many more examples, obviously, on the retail side. But what's the problem with sustainable finance? The key problem with sustainable finance is there is no global standard in reporting sustainable features or sustainability or measuring. Sorry, let me repeat that. There are no global standards to measure sustainability of banks. The same way that we have IFRS nowadays, we can measure an ROE of Bank A and Bank B, ROA of Bank A and Bank B. We do not yet have a standard measurement metrics to measure sustainability of this bank against another bank. We do have sustainability reports, but we don't have the measurement as yet. This is one of the key trends that is going to change the landscape of banking moving forward, because there are already global reporting standards such as GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, and also ISSB, International Sustainability Standards Board, which is a subsidiary of IFRS. And in Malaysia, Bank Negara is coming out with its CCPT, Climate Change and Principle-Based Taxonomy. These standards are gradually being rolled out. And hence, one of the key challenges of banks soon will be reporting according to these standards. And when these standards come into effect, then we will know whether the banks are walking their talk. Those banks who say they champion sustainable finance, we will then be able to compare them on a level playing field. We can be able to compare Islamic banks that champion value-based banking against conventional banks and tell whether Islamic banks are actually practicing value-based banking when those standards come into effect. That is a space to watch. Now, having said that, do I have time? I'm good? Thank you. All right. In the midst of these issues regarding sustainable finance, banks are now faced with a challenge of balancing profitability because they still have stakeholders, shareholders to satisfy. They also need to ensure sustainability. They have stakeholders to satisfy. But at the same time, they need to ensure that they don't create greater financial risk to the financial system, right? And then they are now facing the challenges of the fintech, challenger banks, fintech industry, and what is also known as embedded finance. Now, embedded finance is how finance is integrated, or fintech companies integrate products into retail service providers. For example, you all know Starbucks, and I'm sure a lot of you own the Starbucks Thought Card or even reward program, right? This reward program was introduced by Starbucks in 2008 in the aftermath of the global financial crisis because sales were plummeting. They had to close more than 600 stores in the US alone after the aftermath of GFC. And hence they introduced this reward program, the stored value cards, right? And today, as at Q4 2022, they have more than 29 million customers in the US alone, which is almost 10% of the population, with $1.5 billion of pre-funded balance, which is basically their deposit, at zero interest. Because when you pre-fund the card, you don't get any returns. They have $1.5 billion of zero balance, deposit balance, which is something that any bank will die for nowadays, right? And in the US, 85% of financial institutions or banks have less than $1 billion of assets. And Starbucks has 1.5 billion of deposits. That's embedded finance. You can see embedded finance happening throughout the retail sector. Everyone will offer BNPL nowadays. That's a challenge that financial institutions are facing. So, deposits is the lifeblood of banking, right? And as we all know what happened to Northern Rock in UK in 2008. And last night, if you read the Financial Times today, you will realize that there is a quaint bank called Silicon Valley Bank, which is a technology fund provider. Their share value plummeted, which resulted in the share values of 4 largest banks in the US, including JP Morgan, Citigroup, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo, plummeting by 54 billion. Shares of these 4 banks were wiped out worth 54 billion. Why? Because during the financial crisis, during the COVID crisis, a lot of these banks placed deposits in long-term securities or treasury securities. Now with rising rates, as mentioned just now, what happens to bond prices when yields rise? They drop. So banks that control or have a portfolio of bonds, they see that their value is reducing. This is freaking out investors, and hence people are moving out of banking stocks. That poses a risk as a result of the rising interest rate scenario. Ladies and gentlemen, the challenge that we all face is multidimensional. We face financial market issues, we face fintech issues, and we face a multiple scenario of issues, including how we manage risk. We are now faced with data risk, cyber security risk, and so on and so forth. How you crack that code, how you manage this while maintaining profitability, sustainability, and your risk will be the way that you become successful. How you do that is the billion-dollar question. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have a slew of questions to ask you. Just on the Silicon Valley Bank that you spoke about, how one bank cracked a few companies, just putting it crudely. How do you see monopolies trending moving forward? Do they have to break up like the Googles and the Amazons? Could they do they need to be broken up to manage supply chains? Yeah. And a competitive competitive landscape. And then you also mentioned sustainability reporting. There isn't a standard that globally, yeah. I go back to the earlier question that I asked Namita on business and human rights. There's been a lot of debates on Petronas listing. I go back to Saudi Aramco listing. It wanted to list on NASDAQ, but it could not. It wanted to list on NASDAQ and be one of the largest listed companies in the world. It could not for business and human rights reasons. It then ended up only listing on Saudi Stock Exchange. How do companies such as those who are quite profitable, it would seem, deal with national level issues such as ESGs, because they drag the country with them? How do we trend moving forward in those issues? How does a nation impact a business, a nation's legacy impact a large business? And then finally, the role of, I think you mentioned briefly, the role of such, well, for someone like me, such words like Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, XRP, Litecoin feature a trend moving forward. And on that note, can we go back to Namita on your questions? We'll give each one 5 minutes to address your questions that I asked earlier, and then we'll see if we have time for floor questions.
Thank you very much. And just going back to your questions, you asked me 4 questions, and I'll try to weave that into the answer that I have here for you. So one is, what do financial institutions need to do in terms of attracting more capital towards green or climate related aspects? And I think towards that, there are the challenges that one needs to look at. That's very important. So, right now, availability of granular level data is a big constraint. So, data becomes very critical, right, in terms of authenticity of the data, accessibility of the data, and therefore, weaving that with on the back of that data, being able to draw capital, because it becomes ambiguous, and that also links somewhere back to the human rights or the greenwashing that we just spoke about, right? I think the second bigger challenge in financial institutions is the lack of capacity to understand or correlate between the mainstream business with green or climate businesses, right? I mean, I was with one of the banks in Mauritius, and they said, sustainable finance or green finance. And just a question asked to them was, do you do green tagging, green asset tagging? Do you know what kind of assets are deployed towards financial inclusion? So just mapping this kind of data or tagging this kind of data would give a perspective of how SDG compliant is my bank, or how am I aligned to green finance, right? I think that understanding is still lacking, and therefore that becomes a challenge. And then just look at the supply side, right? The pipeline of bankable projects, I think there's a huge gap there. Lack of public capital to attract more and more of private capital, because public capital has the ability to create mitigation funds or mitigation capital, right? I mean, there are credit enhancements, there's concessional financing, there are blended financing models. So, but there's a lack of those. And then, I go back to Mr. Alvi's point on lack of standards. There are no standards. There are no common standards. So what is believed by A particular country or a B particular country, that differs. So how do you arrive at a common standard? But there is an argument, and we see a lot of that within emerging markets, right? So the global north is very keen to have a common standard, but the global south says it has to be localized, because each country is at a different trajectory of growth, and therefore it can't be one common standard. So how do we find a midway to that? So those are the points that I have covered. I want to come to your point on human rights. I think that's an important point. At an institutional level or at a systemic level within, say, a government or an institutional level, human rights is a part of the value system. And how do you incorporate that through certain practices, certain standards is very important to see. So like a very small thing, toilets for women in factories, they're not there. I mean, in so many countries, there are women workforce, but there are no toilets. And now that there are investors and manufacturers who on the demand of investors are asking these questions, more and more these cases have come.
Correct.
And it's very important to understand that this is a business case. Right? Because if you have sanctions, your business is not going to be operating, and therefore your balance sheet is going to, go down. And the financiers have to think about what is the receivables? What are the cash flows? I mean, that's what we look at, right? So I think that's very important. The last point that you made on the decarbonization in the wake of the Ukraine war, I think that's a very important point, right? See, the detour will have to be there as far as the whole transition path is concerned, because yes, there is, a war, and it has affected multiple economies, right? But I think, overall, through studies and what is coming out is this is a kind of a short-term challenge. It's a grave problem. It's a very big social problem. But it's something that's short-term challenge from an energy security perspective. And why do I say that? See, economic disruption caused by the war has indeed amplified the calls for accelerated energy transition. So if you see what most of the governments are doing to protect their high inflation or their supply chain disruptions, they have made interventions. So if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act by the US, if you look at the RE Power EU plan that is there, or the green transformation by the Japanese government, India, $2 billion allocated to green hydrogen. I think governments are fast, policymakers are fast taking action in terms of how do you provide that energy security. So I would look at that as somewhere in a way, it's bad to say, but the war has made policymakers or governments sit up and think of their dependencies on only certain providers of certain resources. And therefore, how do you move away from that to build in certain systemic approaches within the government? Thank you.
So there are 4 areas that ATFIM could actually quickly pick up, like greater understanding on standardization, supply chain issues, and how net zero targets are being affected by the war, and business and human rights as a part of business value system. George. 2 minutes, George. Take your time, George.
Right. No problem. I'm used to it. I mean, not so I'm used to it. I'm that my staff was always reminded me when I come to the stage and give talks. Yeah. So
George can remember the
if they've not taken their lunch, they'll take their lunch first. Then they will. Anyway, the first question is about 40% contribution of crude oil to the national coffers in a way. Yep. I think how to solve the problems, and even still Sabah has the highest elements of poverty. Okay. What I would say is that for so many years, I don't see there's any political will to actually look into these issues, these matters. But gradually, as the government change, then there are measures being taken. For example, the Malaysian Agreement 63, they're looking into it, and what is due to Sabah, they'll give to Sabah and all those things. So there are agreements after agreement being signed. For example, recently the federal cabinet has approved that Sabah will take care of its energy issues, matters. That's why they have the Sabah Energy Commission being set up to regulate the energy supply and provision in the state of Sabah. So because Sabah is rich in oil, as you say, so that is part of it, parcel of it. Gas and oil is part of it, you see. Again, to me, the way I look at it, yes, they're coming up, but whether it's a real or as I said, it's a populist move or whatsoever, because of the current political scenario in Malaysia.
Well, what could the government be doing? Like one initiative that it hasn't done yet.
Okay. What initiative is not done yet is basically, as I said, if they are able to give more allocation to the states, knowing that
federal
Sabah,
government,
knowing that Sabah also contribute to income tax, Sabah also contribute to whatever like timber and all these things to the federal, but we are only getting back so little of it. Whereas the size of Sabah is about 1/3 of the size of Semenanjung. You go to the rural area in Sabah, you're lucky if you can drive your kancil there. They're still using buffaloes to work, and you go around the country here, road are sealed, electricity are provided, they're well coverage with all these connectivities, but not in Sabah. You see? I mean, I'm not blaming the people here, but I said the people at the ground level and with the Sabah people, we are well connected. They're intermarriages, we understand each other. But again, I think it is maybe the strategy of the politicians, which reflects what is the government policy of the day. Different politicians have their different strategies. It's not the government per se, but it is the politicians that reflects or maybe give implications, a reflection of what the government of the day is.
So you believe higher allocation could alleviate poverty?
I believe that.
Yeah.
Good enough, after we have signed all these things, some of the agreement that signed, this year, for Sabah itself, they are expecting a collections about 6 billion, and they're having a set budget of 4 billion. I think it is a surplus budget, and we're very happy about it. Last year is 5 billion collection, and this year going up to 6 billion. They're expecting maybe go up to 7-8 billion in the future to come through all this kind of realization by what the present government is doing. So I'm hoping it for the best and continue to deal with that. So.
Thank you. Sylvie, do you want to address yours?
So your first question is how much the supply chains
Affect
affect
your infrastructure target.
Okay, so the biggest material used in the physical infrastructure is steel. Do we have the steel industry domestically? Yes, we do, but the size is not sufficient. So the product is not competitive when we talking about the steel coming from China, for example. So what the government did is actually bring the industry to Indonesia. So we have one of the biggest steel manufacturer in Indonesia, which is coming from China, Tsingshan, which helping to provide what the country needs for steel. And the second, the commodity price increase actually unavoidable. So the investment cost per unit 10 years ago will be much lower than the unit cost today. So fiscal is no longer can afford that. So that's why the government actually opened for private sector participation. 10 years ago, when the President Jokowi started to lead, he used SOE and also much on fiscal participation in the infrastructure development. Now it's actually the other way around. So almost probably 70% of the infrastructure development will coming from private. So the government, including us as a DFI, also improving the PPP scheme to support this private participation in the development. And the third, that because the government is aware to have the industry in local, domestically, so the government also reform the investment climate in Indonesia, also reform the industry to make it easier and to make investor friendly, to invite more and more FDI coming to Indonesia. Answer your second question, the scenario to achieve the
what
net zero
could change
target.
the target scenario
Okay.
that could change?
What could change? Okay, we can only achieve the ambitious, accelerated NDC and net zero target with international support. That's what the government is telling the world. Without that, we just come back to our original target, which is lower, 23%, 30% instead of 41% emission reduction, and longer. Instead of 2050 achieving net zero emission, it is 2060. So yes, we got international support already, 20 billion pledge for supporting Indonesia energy transition. But however, it has not been tested yet. We are still arguing, we are still discussing how the transition is doing, because from the government point of view, from Indonesia point of view, transition is not about you just incidentally turn off the coal-fired power plant and build the renewables. The transition should be you give us some times to gradually decrease the emission, gradually shut down the coal-fired power plant while we actually build the renewables. That's something that the government still discuss with the international potential lenders on that. But I think with the increasing price of fossil fuel, the development of green energy is actually become economically viable.
Thank you so much. Tuan Alwi? Can I just have 5 minutes? No, I need to wrap slow. Just injury time, 10 minutes.
Injury time.
please.
So this reminds me of another anecdote, if I can share. You know, when Westerners speak, they will start with disclaimers. They will say, I will only speak on this, and anything other than that is not within my scope. When Asian speakers speak, they will start with apologies. I apologize. For everything, they will apologize. So I like to start with a disclaimer. Some of your questions I can't answer. It's not within my scope. It is very politically sensitive. And I do apologize. Within 1 minute, I'll talk about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency if you like. And from a Sharia compliant point of view, the simple point is, from a Sharia compliant point of view, currency is meant to be a medium of exchange, not a commodity. And therefore, if any currency, Bitcoin, cryptos, or anything else for that matter, are used for trading purposes, then it becomes a big question mark. There are conflicting answers by Sharia scholars whether they are allowed or not. But what is clear is if it is for as a medium of exchange, it is allowed. For trading purposes, it becomes a question mark. Having said that, do you realize that Bitcoin mining is now contributing, the biggest contributor to carbon emissions? So hence, I raise the question again, is it really relevant? Does it really add value to the human society having a Bitcoin currency? I'll leave it to you. Thank you.
I really would love to open it to the floor, but I can't because the Secretary General of UPFIM is right in front of the row. And he said to me, I have to end it on time because I'm actually, what was the sentence you used? Don't fight God. So I'll ask one closing question to all of you, and then I'll show just a very short 3-minute video, which is very relevant for the times. Just one question, which I don't think anyone has really touched upon. What is the role of Cywar and Biowar as in the future trends? Cywar being tech, Biowar being a sort of pandemic of kinds between nations to is it real? Is it not? Could it happen? In 30 seconds. George.
Everything is possible in this world. Yeah. It's how men are being created to be creative and whatnot. Whether they use their creativity for the good and bad of the world. So it's up to the humankind. Yeah.
But businesses should take that into account when in their strategies?
Yes. So that's why as a CEO, as I said again, you must practice a lot of wisdom. You must practice a lot of, you must have the courage to see what is right, wrong, and practice what is right. You must have the temperance to move what you think is right. Not only for your organization, but for your state, maybe for your nation and for the world. And obviously, you must have a strong element of justice to see whatever you do, the decision that you make is good for everybody. So, psych war, bio war is possible as long as it involves human beings. It can happen anytime.
Namita?
Absolutely, I agree, and it's very scary. We saw how the pandemic crippled economies, how we went through lockdowns. I mean, nobody had experienced these kind of things in our lifetime, right? And we only saw that in Tom Hanks movies. So it's become real. I think it is a new kind of terrorism that each country individually and collectively need to fight. We have to only look at how do you factor in mitigants and how do you factor in those walls to be able to contain it from these kind of aspects reaching businesses and economies, and also in terms of human lives. So yeah, I think that's my response. Thank you.
Thank you. Sylvie?
Cyber, biowar, both is possible, very possible with the advance of technology and with the hyperconnectivity. Actually, cyber is already happening, right? As a propaganda. So as a leader, I think we just need to be very, very wise in screening all the news coming And yeah, it's happening. But by war, it's very possible to happen.
Tuan Alwi, and finally.
Agree with all the other speakers.
Thank you. You're very. We must invite him more. You know, he keeps it succinct. Can I just invite you to sit on that side? And there's a 3-minute video. Some of you might have watched this, but it was done by the Pentagon on what the world could be in 2030 and how the Pentagon are preparing. Some parts of it are scary, but most parts of it are real, in my view, as we develop scenarios. Over to the administrators to show the video.
The future is urban. By 2030, urban areas are expected to grow by 1.4 billion, with that growth occurring almost entirely in the developing world. Cities will account for 60% of the world's population and 70% of the world's GDP. The urban environment will be the locus where drivers of instability will converge. It is the domain that by the year 2030, 60% of urban dwellers will be under the age of 18. The cities that grow the fastest will be the most challenged as resources become constrained and illicit networks fill the gap left by overextended and undercapitalized governments. The risk of natural disasters compounded by geography, climate changes, unregulated growth, and substandard infrastructure intersect to frustrate humanitarian relief. Growth will magnify the increasing separation between rich and poor. Religious and ethnic tensions will be a defining element in the social landscape. Stagnation will coexist with unprecedented development as impoverishment, slums, and shantytowns rapidly expand alongside modern high-rises, technological advances, and ever-increasing levels of prosperity. This is the world of our future. It is one we are not prepared to effectively operate within, and it is unavoidable. Megacities are complex systems where people and structures are compressed together in ways that defy both our understanding of city planning and military doctrine. It is an ecosystem that demands a highly agile and adaptive force to successfully operate within. Infrastructures will vary radically, with concentrations of high-tech transportation, globally connected air and seaports, contemporary water, utilities, and waste disposal intermixed with open landfills, overburdened sewers, polluted water, and makeshift power grids. Living habitats will extend from the high-rise to the ground-level cottage to subterranean labyrinths, each defined by its own social code and rule of law. Social structures will be equally challenged, if not dysfunctional, as historic ways of life clash with modern living, ethnic and racial differences are forced to live together, and criminal networks offer opportunity for the growing mass of unemployed. This becomes the nervous system of non-nation-state, unaligned individuals and organizations that live and work in the shadows of national rule. Where physical domains can be seen, digital domains will have limitless potential to breed and expand without limit. Digital security and trade will be increasingly threatened by sophisticated illicit economies and decentralized syndicates of crime to give adversaries global reach at an unprecedented level. This will add to the complexities of human targeting, as a proportionally smaller number of adversaries intermingle with a larger and increasing number of citizens. The scale and density of these domains is daunting. In a city of 10 million, where you hold the support of 99% of the population, the remaining 1% represents a threat of 100,000. It is an environment of convergence, hidden amongst the enormous scale and complexity of the megacity. These are the future breeding grounds, incubators, and launching pads for adversaries and hybrid threats. Linked globally, these are man-made labyrinths that provide refuge and movement across the vast sections of these cities where alternate forms of governance have taken control. The advice of doctrine, from Sun Tzu to current field manuals, has provided two fundamental options. Avoid the cities, or establish a cordon to either wait out the adversary or drain the swamp of non-combatants and engage the remaining adversaries in high-intensity conflict within. Even our counterinsurgency doctrine, honed in the cities of Iraq and the mountains of Afghanistan, is inadequate to address the sheer scale of population in the future urban reality. From the streets of Aachen to the citadel and Way, we have defeated adversaries who attempted to use urban terrain to their advantage. Urban conflict is written deep into the Army's histories. But in tomorrow's conflict, these megacities are orders of magnitude greater in complexity, and our current options do not meet strategic ends. Our future operations must allow us to rapidly return the city to the people. They will be too large and complex to isolate or cordon in their entirety. Yet our soldiers will have to operate within these ecosystems with minimal disruption and flow. Our current and past strategies can no longer hold. We are facing environments that the masters of war never foresaw. We are facing a threat that requires us to redefine doctrine and the force in radically new and different ways. The future army will confront a highly sophisticated urban-centric threat that will require that urban operations become the core requirement for the future land force. The threat is clear. Our direction remains to be defined. The future is urban.
Thank you. And on that note, I'll hand over to the administrators and organizers. I apologize again for overrunning the time. And we may each have our views on that video, but that's for another day for discussion. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you to Ms. Fairuz and our panel of speakers. I am pleased to invite once again our panelists to be on the stage for the Momento presentation. Please welcome. And I would like to invite Encik Muhammad Prasad Hanif, Secretary General of ArtFilm, to present the Mementos. Can we have a group photo together with Encik Prasad, all the panelists, and please showcase the Memento to the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, another big round of applause to the panelists and also the moderator. Thank you very much, and we also thank to Encik Muhammad Prasad Hanif for the Memento presentation.